Class, MASH. By Anutty. Chapter 281, Citadel. MASH didn't think he could get sick anymore. Magical effects aside, he was fairly certain he could prevent anything else. Despite all that, his stomach felt like it was twisting at the moment. He sat across from some elders and Kishiv, who had become elders. Of the elders he had met earlier, only Elder Sirji and AVG were present. They had fewer leaders now that there was only one tree. There were 4 total leaders now, which felt small considering how many people were in the city. The other 2 leaders were Kishiv whom Mash had not met before. One was named Olaji and the other was Taraji. Even if the Kishiv were not the same as the elders, it was a rank that they had been given. And it turned out that the G at the end referred to their rank, not people. When they had changed worlds, their society had changed too. The elders explained how Priscilla had encouraged it. She had claimed that he would have wanted more intermixed people, and they were very accommodating to his preferences. They were seated across from him, and they had already spent several minutes talking. The building was made out of wood. The furniture and floors and everything were wood. He was surprised to learn that they already had several farms set up. The world seemed to encourage plant growth heavily. Already cotton was being grown for cloth and furniture. Mash currently sat on a large cotton pillow with his legs crossed. Everyone was doing the same, but his position was at the center of the circle. His friends were on one side and the elders were opposite them. Mash was the only one who sat facing both. The significance didn't escape him. Despite his lack of involvement, they treated him with a lot of importance. He learned why that had happened too. Priscilla had been heavily involved with the people as they developed their cities. She also helped protect them from the weather. The people here had been astounded by Priscilla's magic. All of that was made even grander by the sheer size of Priscilla's body. She normally kept her size small for convenience's sake. Honestly, he kind of forgot that she could change her body's size. She didn't though, and her body in this world was big enough to crush a house with her body alone. The others had almost thought it was a monster when they saw it. It had been easy to meet with the elders, but it had been hard to be treated like some grand hero or savior. The guilt wasn't even the worst part. He just felt awkward. Priscilla had done an outstandingly good job, but she had deferred all of the credit to him. Mash was glad that Priscilla was so effective. But he couldn't accept their gratitude. He had very literally left them to their own devices. His rules and preferences had been mere suggestions. He did leave Priscilla to watch over them, but he hadn't given her any specific orders. Most of what she had done had been independent. She simply acted with his ideals in mind. And she was doing a better job than him. The elders had been telling him of what had happened since they got here. Mash was most impressed by the construction itself. That was something that Priscilla couldn't help with. She could make wood for materials and shape them for basic houses, but the people had decided to just use the surrounding trees. It made it so that village would blend in with its surroundings more. The city was big, and it made him realize just how big his world really was. The elders' old world had been small, but Mash's was enormous. All of the Kishiv and elders lived in this city. They said that buildings were spread around the area, and they never really felt the need to expand into separate cities or villages. Once Mash learned of the size of the place, he realized that it was bigger than most cities. He had mistakenly thought it was a village. But the elders had come up with their own name for it. They called it the Citadel of Trees. An appropriate name. A grand one that felt too elaborate for what it was. Scattered buildings in a forest didn't really sound like a citadel or even a city for that matter. The size on the other hand made it too big to be a village or town. Mash didn't bother sharing his opinion. Even if the elders wanted it, he didn't feel like he should say anything. The elders and Kishiv hung on every word he had said, so he was being especially careful. As far as Mash was concerned, he had done enough to change these people's lives. They didn't need or deserve anything else. Priscilla seemed more than good enough to manage them. So, despite his uncomfortable guilt, he was relieved. The anxiety that had mounted with his earlier thoughts was gone. This was the second time that Priscilla had saved him from a lot of grief. And he was doubly glad to know that he could leave the job to Priscilla. He didn't feel much like a leader. Despite his brother's words, despite the expectations that Priscilla had of him, he was no leader. All 4 of the elders sat across from him, eyes filled with expectation as they stared at him. So far, they had just given him a rundown of what they had been up to. Mentioned things like their city development and motivation behind designs and the like. About farms that had started to yield crops already. It wasn't just trees that grew quickly, which apparently made farming significantly more profitable and difficult at the same time. Grass, weeds, and trees would invade farms. Mash wondered how trees grew so rapidly, but they apparently had seeds or something to spread. He had listened to everything so far, and now he felt like he needed to share the reason behind the changes and what dangers might appear. I'm glad to hear that you guys are all okay. But my powers changed, and you will be seeing more monsters and maybe other things like fruits and stuff. I'm not sure what exactly is going to happen. I got stronger and this world seems to respond to the changes. The elders were quick to pick up on his words. Their stares were intense and uncomfortable. Elder Sergi was the one to take charge and respond. We have noticed some of these changes. The trees have become much more valuable. But what do you mean by monsters? Mash paused, wondering how he would explain. This wasn't the same question as the test from before. These people just needed to know what to expect and brace for. Carefully choosing his words, Mash replied slowly. The ones you will need to deal with will be like more dangerous animals. Priscilla said you had seen the rats already. They were the ones that walked on all four, had grey fur, and big teeth. Nods from the elders encouraged him, and he kept going. Now he felt more comfortable and didn't speak as slowly. Some will be especially dangerous. The things that fly would be bad. Priscilla can help, but she probably wouldn't win against them. Try to build as many defenses as you can. Maybe the new trees can help? The wood has some magical attributes. Mash hesitated for the last question. He wasn't sure what his trees could do for them, but the elders nodded eagerly. Strangely, they seemed confident rather than afraid. He thought that they didn't understand the danger. Having noticed Mash's confusion, one of the Kishiv elders spoke. The special wood will make powerful servitors. Material is important. Even after spending some time with them, it was hard to tell which elder was which. The Kishiv were almost identical. And Mash for one couldn't separate the two. They didn't have mana or something for his domain to help him separate the two. He ignored that for the moment. What do you mean those things from before? Now Elder Sergi jumped back in and gave a slightly more in-depth explanation. Yes. Their powers and abilities have to do with the material used. I believe these new trees will provide us with extremely capable servitors. The other elders are already working on several different weapons. We should be able to defend ourselves against most of these monsters you have explained. Still. If Priscilla tells you something is too dangerous, please don't try and fight it. She said you had places to hide from the storms. I recommend you hide from some monsters too. They could get really dangerous. Mash put as much emphasis on the danger as he could. He didn't doubt that the elders could make something impressive. He remembered their servitors and the moving floors and furniture in their buildings. They had figured out things that he could not understand. He was sure that the weird trees would be useful. The conversation went a bit more smoothly, but he kept stressing the danger of some creatures. Especially the wyverns, wolves, and dragons. All three would be too dangerous regardless of any weapon. They were definitely skeptical, but Mash thought that would be okay. Except for the wolves, dragons, and wyverns rarely hunted small prey. They wouldn't bother eating things like these people. If anything, they might help deal with the larger wolves that show up. At least he liked to believe that. The rest of the conversation went quickly. Mash kind of wanted to leave as soon as he could, but the elders all insisted that he look around. He would have refused, but the elders explained it was for the other people. The regular workers and people would feel more secure if they saw him. Whether it was guilt or duty, Mash nodded. He begrudgingly agreed to stroll through the city like some kind of hero. Resigning himself to the task, he didn't waste any time. He stood abruptly and started walking toward the door. He only turned back when he noticed the others were still seated. I'll do it. Let's just go. The elders seemed pleased and rose to follow. Of his friends, only Luke had a genuine smile. Jill had a smirk that revealed her thoughts. Red just rose slowly and followed after the others. With the group in tow, Mash walked over to the door. The building was mostly empty on the inside. The bedrooms were on an upper floor and there was a basement for other things. It seemed like these people preferred having a lot of empty space in their buildings. Mash understood that. If he ever bought a house, he would probably do something similar. It was a fairly large building, and the doors were similarly big. It had a set of double doors and a wooden plank that could be placed to lock them. Why would they need a barricade? Then he remembered the storms and imagined they could break a simpler lock. The lock was down too. Mash lifted the wooden block easily and noticed that they had something to lean it on right beside the door. It was clearly designed so that someone could raise and lower the bar with simple pushes. Mash opened the door quickly, wanting to do this quickly. He froze upon seeing what awaited him. When he had entered the building, there had been a relatively large empty space in front of the house. It was no longer empty. Hundreds of people had squeezed in between the trees and surrounding buildings. Some people had been sitting on trees, and others had climbed onto the roofs of buildings. They were all looking at the building. At him. For a second, he met their gazes, and then he shut the door. Chapter 282, Parades. Mash walked through the streets. It was by far one of the worst experiences he could have imagined. He wouldn't be so bothered if the others had joined. But alas, his friends had abandoned him to travel alone. Well, not entirely alone. But alone enough to face the brunt of the states himself. The elders were there though they walked behind him, giving him way too much space. They may as well have been another part of the crowd. Their eyes were filled with gratitude. Mash couldn't understand where all their gratitude was coming from either. He had been the reason behind all of their problems. Solving issues he made didn't feel deserved. It was something he needed to do. That lost thought helped him keep his head up. To meet those gazes with a smile. Even if it was forced. He walked straight through the city. His path didn't take him through the entire city, but anyone that wanted to see him could. As it turned out, that meant mostly the Kishiv. They filled the streets and buildings. Almost everywhere he looked he could see someone trying to get a glimpse of him. Shadows filled the treetops and every window was crowded with families. Mash couldn't think of anything similar back home. They had parades and celebrations, but people had busy lives. Even heroes wouldn't cause such a ruckus. Famous people like the general might, but only if there was a big war going on. Individual people just didn't matter as much. As Mash thought that, he remembered that there was something that could cause a whole nation to react. Monsters. Legendary creatures could do more than stir up an entire nation. There were stories of multiple nations uniting to push back a single sea monster. They wouldn't, or couldn't even try to kill it. The creature was simply too strong. There were few monsters like that, but they existed. Dragons for the entire race were included in that list. There weren't many of them, but it was well known that offending one would bring the wrath of all. Nobody on the planet would hunt or kill even a baby dragon. The risk was too great. Nations had fallen for less, and nobody was dumb enough to offend those monsters. Mash thought that some people could probably harm them, if not worse. Igan popped into his mind alongside the general. He didn't imagine there were many things out there that could resist the two of them if they chose to fight together. The skies and the seas were dangerous. But the land had its own legends. His wandering thoughts distracted him. The sounds of the city turned into a background murmur. The states blended into the surroundings. And so, he walked with his head high. Although his mind had gone elsewhere. It was only when he got to the edge of the city that he came back to the moment. The streets ended. No more buildings peeked in between trees. It was the edge. He turned slowly and saw the crowd. Several more elders had joined the group, but they had blended into the mass of people before him. Seeing them stand there like that was ominous. He stood separated from them. Standing by himself, he realized what this felt like. His match had been in solitude. His mind detached from the people he faced now. The way they stood against him made him feel truly like a monster. He alone stood to oppose them. The people had gathered at the edge of the city to watch him. Then Mash took a step forward. He would not end this march as the monster. Completely separated from the people he was supposed to help, maybe even to lead. The wrongness had urged his feet on. The thoughts of monsters and people made him step into the crowd. It opened his mouth. He needed to speak and show them that he wasn't a monster. Hello. I am sorry. I changed your lives and put you in this unknown place. And it seems like it will get more dangerous. I will try and protect you all, and Priscilla will still be around too. But you need to know that I am just one person. Wait. I can be more. Mash was standing in the crowd. The people surrounding him. There were too many people and the elders couldn't stop them from closing in. It wasn't like the people wanted to hurt him. They squeezed together to get whatever they could from him. Mash didn't know what they expected. His words had caused a shift though. Most of the people had been listening out, paying his words back so that more could hear. Now, silence hung in the air as Mash used his new skill. The first thing he made looked like him. Well, a sculpture made entirely of wood. Mash knew that it wasn't exactly the same thing, but it did have access to his skills. Some of them at least. Mash felt a connection to his creations and had some idea of what they could do. It would be enough. They could protect the people. That was all he wanted. His health drained as more and more wooden creatures grew from his body. At first, they were just different sculptures of him, but then he made other things. Dragons and sphinxes ranging in many different sizes came forth and took the air. He gave each creation command and gave control of them over to Priscilla as well. These were powerful things and his life drained away with each one. Before long he had to stop. His body felt weak and he worried briefly about whether he could kill himself with skill or not. Once he was done, he fell to the ground. One of the sculptures of himself was quick to respond and caught him. He half slumped against it but tried to stand straight. After a second he gave up, and just slid to the ground. He crossed his legs and gestured for the people around him to do the same. Some did, but many remained standing. It was enough and Mash spoke again. This time he didn't try to project his they would pass the message back. He was sure of it. These creations are like servitors but have most of my abilities. Including the portal creation. I will be able to know if anything bad happens now too. I know it's not perfect, but they will help watch over you. It felt right to say that. Those words would hopefully reassure them. They didn't react much and he struggled to read their thoughts. His domain let him get a general feel for the crowd, but he couldn't pick up on individual emotions anymore. Why? The question came from one of the Kishiv elders nearest to him. He sat just to the right of Mash. Mash slowly turned to face the man. He eyed him with confusion. He didn't understand the question. Another elder, not a Kishiv, seemed to understand. Why did you do all this for us? The question felt like it hit him. With how drained he was, he felt dazed by it. Mash took several long seconds to process it, but his answer was simple. Because I had to. This was my fault, to begin with. But who would save a people they did not know, even for honor or justice? Elder Sirji interjected. Mash was too tired to answer the questions fully. At the moment, he was just acting on instinct. Me. Mash's one-word answer silenced the crowd. The crowd gathered around him just froze. The answer was ridiculous. Although it laid the truth out plainly. Not that these people had any real reason to trust him. His actions would prove his intentions. If they didn't, then he had let them down. It was a simple answer. Mash couldn't help but feel like he was answering a lot of questions today. He was drained. Both his energy and health were lower than they had been in a long time. He actually didn't know if his health had ever been this low. He remembered a dagger in his neck and a fall that had almost killed him. That should have killed him. His health had fallen lower back then. The wyvern has been pretty bad too, but he hadn't been as weak then. He's had his close calls, and this couldn't really compare. Although his health was very low. His skill was dangerous. He would need to be careful about making these things during a fight. Although he would be able to recover more easily during a fight. He would need to change his tactics. Even before Priscilla's warning, he could tell that his mind had wandered again. He was too drained to focus and the crowd still hadn't dispersed. Mash forced a weak smile and spoke softly. I'm tired. Let's get back to whatever. I want to take a nap. His words didn't need to be repeated. The crowd broke. Mash could tell that some wanted to stick around. But they still listened to him like he was some kind of deity. It bothered him. He had hoped his actions would make them more comfortable. That didn't seem to be the case. After his display of power, he could understand though. The elders spent their lives making servitors, but his skills let him make even more incredible things in moments. He hoped it didn't discourage them. Their creations were incredible and not just because anyone could use them. The things they made didn't rely on magic or an individual. Their creations had a permanence that Mash didn't. When he died there would be no one who could replicate his creations. Mash's power was his own, but the servitors were just common technology. Something that would be timeless. Something that would continue to give and improve. It didn't really take all that much time for the entire group to vanish. The 4 elders from earlier remained, but the majority was gone now. Some children stuck around. They hid behind corners or trees. Well, they tried to hide. Not a very good attempt by most. One child was sticking their whole head around one tree. Kishiv's unique appearance made that gesture strange. He left them alone and spoke to the elders instead. I'm going to leave soon. Probably as soon as I finish resting. Unless you need me for something. He received a lot of quick rejections and rushed shakes of his head. He nodded and remembered one last thing. Oh yeah. Those two replicas can make portals themselves. If you need me for anything, let Priscilla know. The creations aren't particularly smart. But they can help with a lot. The elders nodded. It felt like they were more hesitant to speak now. How had that been the outcome? He didn't sigh, but he wanted to. He just activated inhuman hibernation and closed his eyes. Chapter 283, Cold Skies. Mash had left his world after resting a little. The others had found him at one end of the city. They had teased him about the parade. Although they were nowhere near as bad as his brother. His brother had been waiting for them, and he was rather angry to find out that he hadn't returned immediately. Thankfully, he had learned of the group from the general and knew that they would probably be fine. The fact that the general knew about them was a little surprising, but it shouldn't have been. She was high level, and he figured that most high-leveled individuals knew one another. He still had a lot of explanations he needed to give, but his brother was mollified fairly easily. If anything, he was just mad that Mash hadn't returned to give him some reassurance. After dealing with his siblings, Mash left the city as well. It felt like he had been there too long. While he had been traveling a little, the stuff with Egan had made him think that his fate had caught up to him. The time to go had arrived and the group decided to go visit Timur. They had only caught a glimpse of Timur's home, but Mash remembered the small horde of monsters assailing his home. The cold didn't bother them much, and the monsters were tempting. Plus, it would be another continent. A kingdom that they hadn't explored. Jill had teleported them as far north as she could. Which was the snow plains they were at earlier. They could have looked around for more monsters, but they wanted to go somewhere else. Mash considered looking for those monsters which could heal themselves. They were supposed to be somewhere underground, but the others weren't as interested. In the end, they agreed to look for 2 hours. If they couldn't find the monsters, they would just need to return later. That was fine considering that it would only ever require a second to get back. Sometimes he just forgot how convenient travel had become because of Jill. Mash flew over the snow plains. The others were doing the same but in different places. They were trying to find a way underground. A tunnel, cave, or crevice. The monsters were supposed to be fairly large, so he thought they would be easy to find. What he hadn't accounted for was the snow. The snow was thick and hid any blemish that would normally be visible. Holes or the like would probably be filled with snow. Flying was actually making it harder to find the monsters, but going on foot would probably mean fighting more wolves. Mash didn't hesitate any longer and flew toward the ground. Snow buffeted his face. It had been the entire time, but he felt it more when diving. Most of the snow in the area came from the surrounding mountains. It didn't simply fall from the sky but swirled about as the wind kicked it around. He barely noticed it when flying in the sky, but it was thicker near the ground. His landing sent up another cloud of snow. The top of the snow was light, but the ground was packed tightly. He hoped that walking would be more productive. His domain should help at the very least. Another idea came to mind. His arm went up, and he made a living wood imitation of Priscilla. The wooden creation seemed to come from his skin. It almost looked like it would tear off a chunk of flesh, but it didn't blemish his skin in the slightest. The imitation slumped out and fell into the snow below. Mash looked at it carefully. He hadn't tested what abilities his imitations would have, but he assumed it would be all of them. He knew they had some access to his skills but not all of his bodily functions. Skills like making wood and his domain were replicated, but they didn't have his mimic's avarice or most of his chimeric skills. The knowledge made him pause. He knew a lot about his creations. Normally skills would take a decent amount of testing to fully understand, but he felt like he knew the limitations of his imitations. It was like they were just another part of him. Just as he knew the limits of his own eyes, he knew what the imitations could do. The drain on his health was noticeable, but it was something he couldn't measure exactly. He checked his status quickly. Name, Mash Stel Lumber Class, Chimeric Vagabond. Level, 112. Health, 3124/3300. Energy, 4400/4400. It wasn't a nice even number. Plus, it was completely different from his earlier use of the skill. That meant that there was a range for the drain. The skill was quickly becoming riskier, although the advantage was huge. His creations generated their own energy and had access to almost all of his magic. And they could react to situations. They could do things like dodge and maneuver. He hoped that would make it good at finding some tunnels. It had some of Priscilla's abilities mixed with his own. He wasn't sure if it could make true imitations of itself, but he figured it was worth the test. Take control of it. Priscilla would be better at controlling an imitation of herself. Not needing to confirm anything, she immediately got to work. Mash paid careful attention to what Priscilla tried. His domain let him keep track of her energy and the magic within the imitation. The imitation started the process, and he saw it recreate his skill. But it wasn't the new version. When it made an imitation, it didn't give up its health. Nor did its creations breathe or act alive. Strange. I recreated the energy flow perfectly. The skill uses something other than energy. Mash felt Priscilla arrive at the same conclusion. His living wood creations couldn't make more. It might be intelligence or something inherent to his strange body, but the imitations wouldn't be able to replicate themselves. A disappointment for sure, but they could at least make something. The wooden versions of Priscilla scattered about, spreading from him in a circle. They would scour the grounds. Mash started walking in his own direction. Senses spread as far as he could with his domain. He didn't need to find these monsters, but he wanted to. A healing ability on monsters was rare. Rare enough that one of the closest monsters with it was at the very edge of the continent. Mash walked and tried to feel into the ground. For a while, he found nothing but snow and dirt. However, he was lucky. Luck might not be the right word. Things tended to happen around him. Closer to the end of the hour, he found a tunnel. It was smaller than he expected, though it was enough. Mash felt it with his domain, and almost missed it too. The snow had packed tightly into the tunnel, and he only sensed a small bit of the tunnel. At first, he thought that it was just a loose packet of dirt or something, but he noticed the ground move. It was a small motion, but it wasn't one that he caused. Found it. The message wasn't for Priscilla. She sent it to her friends. They could communicate remotely now. Priscilla's imitations were quickly proving themselves the most useful in the group. It is a matter of individual abilities. My superior control and intelligence extend to the imitations that we create. Regardless of the informative tone that Priscilla tried to project, Mash picked up on her smugness. She was enjoying the praise even if it went unsaid. His thoughts and emotions were open to her. He let her bask in the genuine praise. Her reasoning didn't really matter. Priscilla had been irreplaceable. And she had helped him through some surprisingly human problems. The snow beside jumped from the ground, as Jill dropped into it. She appeared there suddenly. He hadn't thought about how her teleports would work something easily movable like snow, but he saw it now. The snow shot outward from where she teleported to. The space had emptied itself to fit Jill. The snow slowly fell back onto her, and she shivered. Her words came out quickly though. Where are they? She was shouting and had her needle in one of her arms. The space around the tip was slightly warped. He stared at the tip for a second, before holding his hand out. His thumb pointed down, and her eyes dropped to the ground. How far? She hesitated a little as she lowered her weapon. It had been poised to stab something. Had she really expected to teleport into their den or something? He wouldn't do that. Ignoring her action, he just responded. It's at the edge of my domain. So around 50 feet. Straight down too. She stared down. Then she raised one hand and moved her fingers like she was estimating some distance. You want me to clear it? No. Mash didn't shout, but his reply was made louder as Red joined him. She landed beside Jill. A frown was on her face as she touched the ground. You are going to destroy this whole place if you do that. Red's words matched his own thoughts. I was just going to try teleporting the snow and ground. I should be able to do it. I mean, I wasn't going to make as big an explosion. Jill's reply had phases. It started with a genuinely good idea, but it broke under Red's persistent glare. Jill's own eyes slowly drifted downward as she kept going. By the end, she admitted to wanting to use her explosion. Her forehead was firmly pointed toward the ground now. Just try and move the snow. To Mash's surprise, Red relented if only a little. She encouraged Jill to try what she had said at first. Jill was obviously surprised too, as her head snapped up in one quick motion. To her credit, she replied quickly with only a slight amount of hesitation in her voice. Yeah, I should be able to do that. Sounds good, I will be over there. Mash schooled his face into a serious expression. He spoke and pointed toward a mountain in the distance. The snow wasn't the only thing that made it hard to see. It was far. Jill grinned, and Mash let himself do the same. Red rolled her eyes a little, and Luke stepped around a tree and all heads turned toward him. His sleeves were stained with blood. Soaked in it really. The red ran all the way up to his shoulders although he looked otherwise uninjured. Luke looked around for a second. I guess I was the only one to run into the wolves. Well, where are these insect things? Below us, how many levels? Mash was jealous, and he had to know. Luke smiled and held up 3 fingers proudly. Jill groaned loudly, and Mash did the same. Red shook her head and stomped a foot. The snow parted as her foot dug into the densely packed ice. We will get our chance as soon as Jill moves this snow. Got it. Jill jumped at Red's words and rubbed her hands together. She didn't immediately start though. They all moved away from the ground. Jill probably wouldn't fail or destroy everything, but they had all seen what her magic could do. As durable as their group was, none of them wanted to test themselves against Jill's attack. There weren't many things that could harm legendary beings, but he couldn't help but think that she could. Chapter 284, Bugging. Despite all their jokes, everyone gave Jill a large amount of space to test her magic. It was probably a needless precaution, but nobody wanted to risk anything. Even Jill was as far away from the location as possible. And unlike Mash, she could use her skills remotely. She was actually the only of the group, whose magic didn't need to originate from her body. Theoretically Red and Mash should be able to do the same, but their magic came more naturally from their bodies. Red could control other people's blood, but she said it was hard if they were alive. Mash himself was in a slightly more unique situation. His magic started from his body. It was like a monster in that sense. Nearly all monsters had abilities that came from their bodies. They didn't call lightning from the sky. It just wasn't done. Jill floated beside him, her hand outstretched toward the snow. Mash had used his feet to carve a circle into the snow. The circle was slightly larger than the tunnel itself. He wasn't really sure how Jill planned on removing the snow, but he thought it would help a little. Now he just watched her, trying to use his domain to understand anything. Not that he really expected to learn anything. It wasn't like he would figure out space magic by observing someone, but Priscilla might at least get a feel for it. Just recognizing it could be useful. Jill's hand closed into what seemed like a fist. Then she opened it and closed it again. It seemed kind of like she was flexing her fingers. Then he saw it for it really was. She was making a grabbing motion. What are you doing? Mash was hovering in the air beside her. Since they weren't moving, it was quiet enough that he could speak without using the mental messages. Jill's eyebrows drifted together as she concentrated on the snow. She snapped at him for interrupting her focus. I'm trying to move the snow. What does it look like? Like you're grabbing at nothing. Her eyes shifted toward him a little, but she lowered her hand. Yeah, I'm trying to picture a hand grabbing the space. Mash thought about that for a second and shook his head slowly. Why? Can't you just teleport all of the snow? No, it doesn't work like that. I can't teleport parts of things. The snow there is connected to the rest. So, I was just trying to move it, or separate it at least. She explained it simply, but other questions popped into Mash's mind. Like why couldn't she teleport a part of something? Did it have to do with mana or was there some other reason behind it? Although, he didn't ask any of those questions. Priscilla had an idea, and he felt like it was good enough to work. Can't you trap the snow in a barrier? Then just teleport the barrier. Jill hadn't really been looking at him during the conversation. To be fair, he wasn't either. Their eyes were toward the snow on the ground, and he could see her face with his domain. His suggestion now got her to turn her head at him. Her eyebrows were raised as she stared incredulously at him. Mash went on. Yeah, Priscilla said that your barriers should work anywhere. I think she's right considering it's not like it's made of air. Jill nodded slowly and looked down at the snow. She teleported down to it. Mash was tempted to go down there too but decided he didn't risk any backlash. She bent and laid a hand against the snow. A second later she stood and held up her thumb. He guessed that meant it worked. He looked at where the snow was, but it didn't really look any different. Her barriers weren't visible to the naked eye. He could only see it with his domain. Otherwise, it completely blended into the space. Still holding her hand out, she teleported again. This time a tunnel of snow teleported with her. It wasn't just snow either. Dirt and even stone went with her. She hadn't moved much, but she stood on a tower of dirt and snow that was right beside the hole she had just made. The snow and dirt fell beneath her, collapsing suddenly. Jill stumbled and fell along with the rest of the tower. She landed into a pile of snow as the rest of the tower deteriorated. Her hand jutted out from the snow and she pulled herself up. Mash, Red, and Luke all descended to help her out, but it was mostly unneeded. Jill climbed out of the snow and stood proudly at the top of the mound of snow. The snow at the top was pristine, but large sections of dirt could be seen just beneath it. Jill was smiling, her teeth visible as she began to laugh. Her hair clung to her head, and her clothes were dark with water. She was visibly shivering, but that didn't stop her smile. She shouted up at them as they landed. It worked. It was so easy, but that was a lot of mana. She was bouncing at her feet, but her eyes were locked onto Mash. He didn't match her excitement, but there was a smile on his face too. They landed and Jill tried to dry herself off with a towel. It wasn't working, and she sighed. Her smile broke. "Give me a few minutes, I need to change." With that, she blinked away. The three of them landed, and awkwardly stood around for a couple of seconds. Mash walked over to the hole that had been made. Snow was already beginning to fill the pit, but he was staring at the walls. The stones were cut impossibly smoothly, although the dirt and snow weren't holding as much. They crumbled and fell into the hole. Mash wondered if she could do that with a monster. Her skills were horrifying. It was just too abrupt. One instant he was alive, and the next he was dead. Completely gone. Erased from the world without leaving a trace. In a sense, her skills were the most frightening. Lost in his thoughts, Mash barely noticed as Jill reappeared. "I'm going to need some time to recover." Apparently teleporting something like that takes a lot of mana. Her words eased the tension in his shoulders. He still stared at what she had done, but at least it wasn't something she could do all the time. It was probably a petty, jealous thought, but he couldn't shake it. He often thought about his friends' skills and classes. Gushed over things that they had, and he lacked. They probably did the same. Everyone felt like that at times. Mash was looking down the hole, so he was the first to spot the monsters. The first thing he had seen was a long limb. The limb was jointed in 3 different places and had strange spines along an otherwise straight limb. The end was pointed. It dug into the dirt, and another limb quickly followed it. As 2 identical limbs joined the first, Mash remembered what he was looking for. Monsters, specifically insectoid monsters. More legs came from an opening in the side. The sharp ends dug into the dirt and snow as it pulled itself out. The monster was not what he had expected. He was expecting something spider-like. Especially after seeing the many legs. However, it had more than just 8 legs. Almost a dozen legs were visible as the creature's head peeked into the tunnel. Mash knew bugs. Everyone did. People encountered all manner of them in the course of a single day, but he was still surprised by what he saw. The leg's shape and number made him expect something like a spider, but the monster was not like that. The creature's head was oddly triangular with large oval eyes at the ends of it. The snow and dirt crumbled as it pulled its entire body out. And the body was long but not segmented. The creature wasn't segmented like a centipede. Only once he got a good look at the entire thing did he recognize it. And that was only because he saw where the legs were connected. They stuck to the long abdomen of the insect, but the joints and way they moved reminded him of a mantis. However, it had far too many arms and legs for normal. His back went straight as he recoiled from disgust. He saw Luke shudder as the creature began scaling the walls. The monster didn't have an even number of limbs and it had legs and arms everywhere. Each one just seemed to grab and pull at whatever it could. It was a blessing to see that it only had one head. The creature had a greenish carapace, but it was hard to see with so many moving legs. Some of the legs couldn't reach the dirt or snow, and just flailed about in the air. They collided together making a clicking noise that was random and terrifying. It wasn't disturbing with just one, but an echo of clicks rumbled out from behind the one monster. The noise alone told Mash that there would be hundreds of things. The hole was small, and the first creature only barely managed to drag itself through. Mash some legs break off and stick to the tunnel. But it didn't even slow as it ran along the wall. The path was too tempting for the monsters. Mash didn't think he could understand such a monster, but he felt like it was hungry. Starving even. And now it had found something it could eat. That hunger was something Mash understood. He had seen it in many monsters, but that wasn't what made it obvious. No. It was the fact that he felt it too. Whether it was a product of his skills or choices, he felt that same hunger as he stared at the insect. It was a repulsive thing, and the rumbling of his own stomach disgusted him. His body was reacting despite the protest his eyes and mind were making. The insect looked unappetizing, or he thought it should, but his body reacted. He wasn't human, and this was just another reminder of that. His hunger was that of a monster. That of a creature that wanted nothing more than to survive. To grow. His skills wanted him to eat the insect and steal what he could from it. The feeling surged in him alongside his excitement. Like a thrill, it moved him to action. The insectoid monster had made it over halfway up the hole, but he didn't wait any longer. He jumped into the hole. None of his friends had received any notice, but they didn't seem surprised. Although they didn't support him either. Mash could feel them watching. His role was this to some extent. Jill was probably the best at baiting out attacks and learning about new monsters, but she wasn't durable. Luke and Red were durable although to lesser degrees than Mash. On top of being able to fight long, his straightforward style let the others get an idea of how strong a monster was. If it could seriously hurt Mash, it would likely be deadly to the others. A smile crept onto his face, as scales began to grow along his body. He was finally back where he belonged. Chapter 285, Healing? Lightning shot from Mash's hand as he fell toward the insect. It flashed brightly in his eyes, but he was still able to see despite it. And that let him see the monster completely ignore his lightning. He hadn't put much power behind the attack. He had just wanted to stun it, but his attack hadn't even slowed it. The only thing it could be was magical resistance. His domain would have let him notice if it used magic or anti-magic to block the lightning. The magic didn't do anything. It just took the hit and kept moving. There was nothing magical about its defense though. The creature's body was naturally resistant, and Mash had the feeling that it was a general resistance. Probably to all magic in general. That alone would make these things a menace, but he knew that they could heal on top of all of that. Let the others know. Mash sent the message to Priscilla. He had given each of his friends a real imitation of Priscilla and could communicate through them now. Distance and security weren't really a concern anymore either. He didn't wait or receive any confirmation. His focus shifted to the fight. He was close enough to the cavern's entrance to feel more insects approaching. His domain let him see at least 2 more of the things. Although the exit was too narrow to allow more than one through at a time. But the hole was getting bigger as the monsters tried to funnel through it. The first monster was getting close now. Mash twisted his body. He turned and brought his foot down on the insect as he landed. His dragon form made his legs bigger, and his feet were nearly twice as large. The soles of both of his feet collided with the insect's head. It hadn't even tried to dodge. Mash heard a very distinct breaking noise, as his feet pushed on the monster's skull. The insect crumpled under his feet. Its head got pressed into its abdomen. A countless number of arms and legs snapped as well. The way it crunched underneath reminded him oddly of a cookie. The sound at least was the same as that first bite of a truly crunchy cookie. His knees bent sharply as he landed. His hands swung out grabbing some of the legs. The hole around him was crumbling rapidly. The snow and dirt slowly fell to fill the hole. It would take a while for the snow to completely fill it, but he was sure that it would happen. He didn't even hesitate a little and popped one of the monster's legs into his mouth. It crunched as his sharpened teeth broke the hard shell of the insect. It was salty. It almost felt like he had just stuffed his mouth with a handful of salt. Not a very pleasant experience, and he didn't have the time to check what affinities he gained. The insect he stood on moved. It hadn't died from having its head crushed. Nor its body caving in on itself. But that wasn't the only issue. The hole that the insect had squeezed out of exploded. Dirt and snow fell as more monsters rushed out. They didn't slow in the slightest and the corpse that Mash was standing on was pushed upward. The sound of chitin breaking was loud. It felt like the ground beneath him was breaking. Which it was. Insects forced themselves into the opening, completely ignoring how much actual space was available. They crushed one another not caring at all for their surroundings. His domain let him watch the horrific process as one of the monsters lost its footing and was immediately trampled by others. They didn't seem to care for anything but escape. Mash stumbled as the insect he stood on got pushed to the side. His knees bent slightly, and he pushed the insect down as he leaped out. The force of his jump caused a ripple among the monsters, but it didn't slow the tide. It just led to the insects at the front being crushed against the walls. They were dying, killing one another in a desperate scramble for the sudden opening. Everything around him crunched. The snow, the bugs, and even the stone crunched as the insects pushed their way through. Even though he had jumped, he hadn't really gotten much ahead of the mob. They were right behind him. They must have been trapped somehow, kept stuck beneath the snow. But there had been ways out and in. The guilds had said as much, though he didn't really know how old the information was. While the Adventurer Guild updated their information whenever they could, it didn't mean that they actually had all of the information on a location. Monsters could grow or new ones could move in. Both of which had likely happened. He should have realized it sooner. The guild hadn't known about the extremely large wolves. That should have told him that the information they had was outdated. He just hadn't considered it. Did the others think of it? He felt it, as another insect pressed against his foot. They were moving faster than before. A sudden burst of speed as they approached the opening. Then he heard the first click. The strange sound reverberates from the insect beneath his feet. As the monster made the noise, he felt a vibration run up his foot. The sensation made him flinch reflexively, and he used his wind attunement to carry him up faster. It gave him a small boost, but enough to get out of the hole a few seconds ahead of them. Which was apparently the cue for Red to rain blood down on them. It fell on them like rain, but they were much sharper. Tiny blades of reddish-black blood managed to pierce the chitin of the monsters. And the monsters didn't seem to care. They pushed through the blood. Mash watched as their chitin began to darken around the spots the blood hit. Red's blood was worse than any poison, and these monsters clearly weren't immune to it. An attack like that should have slowed them. Other monsters and most people would have fled. But these things only pushed on. The ones that had taken the brunt of the blood were dying and their bodies weren't moving as swiftly as the others. That didn't stop the tide behind them. The dying insects were pushed and crushed into the mess of bodies, as more monsters pushed. All of this happened in a few seconds, and then the first group of insects emerged from the hole. The monsters went insane. The clicking noise they had made by knocking their limbs together returned tenfold. It echoed across the snowy landscape as more of the monsters escaped. The monsters didn't just run at them either. Instead, they ran in every possible direction, climbing over one another. Most of the insects seemed to ignore Mash and his friends completely. Only the ones that were already heading in their direction even took note of them. Their limbs raised as the first of them approached. The dozens of pointed limbs were raised like spears. It was followed by others. A giant golden hand encircled the first 3 insects and crushed them into a fist. The same fist swung around, granting them a small bit of space. Red shouted while blood swirled around her hands. Mash, block the entrance. We can't contain them like this. His body was moving before she said anything. Although he wasn't planning to block the hole. He had started running around the opening. His plan involved just destroying as many as he could while getting to the other side. They had unconsciously stepped back. The noise and number had made them wary. And they had stepped away and given up the easy choke point. That had been a mistake, an amateurish one at that. The kind of mistake that someone with years of experience wouldn't make. To him, it was a reminder. They had leveled quickly and were stronger for it. But at the same time, they made mistakes that others might not. Already 24 of the insects had escaped, but he just focused on sealing the hole. Mash had a simple solution in mind. Wood grew from his back. A wooden limb like a tail had grown from the center of his back. In the end, he started making a large flat disc. It would be a seal for the hole that they had made. He put his weight on his right foot as he abruptly turned. And charged toward the oncoming stream of insects. Lightning hadn't done much, so he didn't bother with it. His dragon form alone made him strong enough to tear through the insects, but he still wanted more. His form changed slightly as his muscles bulged. They became denser and his teeth grew even sharper as he mixed the wolf form with the dragon one. The two forms blended together well. Rather than his dragon form simply taking precedent, the two forms worked on his body in slightly different ways. His reflexes and instincts were honed by the wolf form. It let him react a bit faster. The dragon form gave him raw speed and power that his other forms couldn't really match. He charged headlong into the swarm of insects. While his lightning might not be that useful here, he thought that his woodwork was better. It hadn't become that much harder, but it was a little stronger. Not to mention he could still reinforce it with his enchantments. Blades of wood grew from the palm of his hands. They weren't really swords. Just really long blades, and he didn't bother trying to make them sharp. They would cut, either way, so he just made them as durable as he could. Slightly glowing etchings spread down the blade as it grew further and further from his hands. He charged into the mass of insects. With his hands thrust out to his sides, he charged into the insects and tore through them. The first line of the monsters was split in half by his blades. A few insects struck his body, but they exploded in a mass of blood and viscera. Their blood was red as anyone else's, but it stank like rotten milk. Some of the blood flooded up his nose and mouth. He forced himself to swallow. Even the monster's blood would help him. Although these monsters weren't all that strong individually, and the blood of a handful of them only barely raised his stats. With his domain, he could track all of the insects around him. And he saw what exactly their healing was like. Insects that he had cut in two, reconnected themselves to whatever they could find. They didn't need to rejoin with their own bodies. They simply grabbed whatever was nearest. Many of the monsters had even more limbs and some had too few to even move with. All of them continued to flail. It disappointed him. The healing wasn't magical. It was a bestial thing of monsters. And he realized with another sickening thought, that he already had that ability. A monster's healing. He shouldn't have expected anything else. He slowed after charging through another wave of the insects. Although he still hadn't made it to the hole. They just didn't stop flooding out of the hole, which was only getting bigger as more insects stuffed through it. Now even more monsters were flooding out. He didn't care though. They couldn't stop him. He was so sure of it. Right up until he slipped. He charged into another insect, but his foot skid across some blood that had frozen too quickly. Chapter 286, Armies vs Individuals. Even though he had been stomping his foot, there was simply too much viscera around. His leg skidded forward as he tumbled back slightly. His head swung through the air, but it didn't crash into the ground. The large seal he had grown, prevented him from hitting the ground directly. The wood pressed into the ground, as insects charged into him. They clawed wildly, scratching at his scales and wood. They couldn't do much, but there were so many attacking him that he couldn't see anything but carapace. His domain let him see how the insects were piling on him. They squeezed into one another trying desperately to overwhelm him. It didn't work. Mash swung his arms together. They had managed to cut his wood in some places, but they didn't get all the way through it. The wooden blades swept through the pile of insects. He bisected many of them, but they didn't stop their flailing. Even the disconnected parts of their bodies continued to flail about. A stray limb, one of the hundreds, managed to strike one of the few unprotected places on his body. A claw dug into one of his eyes. He felt liquid run down his cheek, and then the insect pulled. Pain spread from the eye, lancing through the rest of his face. His eye was torn out, and Mash screamed. His shout was a mix of a howl and a roar. As his mouth opened, the insects started to fill it. Their limbs scratched at the inside of his mouth, and he tasted blood. His mouth was full of it, but his mind was filled with something else. Anger surged, and he forced his eyes shut. Why had even had them open? It's not like he needed them to see. His domain was easily big enough to cover the insects around him. The anger twisted. It was arrogance or pride. It was a stupid thing, and it stuck to him. How many times would he do the same idiotic thing? Was it his form or his race? Wolves and dragons were prideful creatures. No, he couldn't blame something like that. It was just him. That acceptance turned his pride into fury. His mouth slammed shut. His teeth tore apart the insect's limbs. They crunched as he bit down. The wooden blades had broken at this point, but he didn't need them. His arms shot out and he grabbed two of the insects in his fists. In his dragon form, his hands were a little larger. They were just barely big enough for his claws to dig into the edges of their central carapace. They had a thin long segment where the majority of the limbs were connected, and his hand could almost encompass the whole thing. Pain and anger mixed into a rage, and he tried using his chimeric reconstruction. He didn't know if it would work, but he was acting on instinct. His skill started, and Mash felt a difference now. He no longer saw it as something magical. It was something physical. The strangest thing was the wall he felt. The skill was a contest of power. It wasn't something like magical resistance. Not an arbitrary thing like willpower or life force either. Ultimately it just came down to raw power, and he was far stronger than any one insect. He overwhelmed the creature. His skill activated, and the insect crumpled into his palm. Normally, the creature seemed to melt into his skin. Now, it was a little different. The insect got sucked into his hand. Its carapace cracked and crumpled like a sheet of paper. The clicking stopped at once, but other sounds filled the gap. The two insects in his hand didn't scream, but their limbs desperately struck his scales. However, even that was quiet compared to the sound of things breaking. The insects' shells were hard like stone, and they were loud when they broke. The other insects seemed to sense something, and Mash felt the monsters hesitate. He didn't though. Anger still bubbled within him, and he reached for another two insects. The insects he absorbed had completely vanished, only small bits of their carapace and few limbs had remained. There was no perfect way to describe the feeling. It wasn't like eating. He imagined it was what plants felt when they absorbed water and light. The monsters broke down and melted into his flesh. The other insects grew more frenzied. They were panicking. Mash didn't know what had changed, but he could see them with their domain. Whether they were afraid or furious was hard to tell, but he saw the coming mass of insects shift. They still spread around, but now more insects were funneling towards him. They swarmed around him, circling in an ever-increasing mass, filling any gaps. He almost wondered if he could suffocate, but doubted that they could stop air from flowing. Mash felt his eye heal as the next two insects met the same fate as the previous. The gaps he made were quickly filled, but he didn't care. He kept grabbing and destroying everything he could. He was still on his back, only propped upright by the wooden seal he had made. He used that to his advantage and grew more wood from his back. They weren't limbs but replicas made of wood. True replicas that took with them a portion of his health. They weren't made in his image though. Instead, he modeled them after Priscilla, albeit they were much larger than she would normally be. As they grew in size, he was pushed onto his feet. He didn't open his eye and had altered his body to grow scales over his ears and nose. Despite cutting off most of his senses, he didn't really need them. His domain was more than enough, and he knew that he was facing the right way. All he would need to do was trudge forward and find the hole where these monsters were coming from. Even without sight or sound, he could feel the monsters scratching his scales. Not that he needed to. His domain wasn't really needed either. There were so many insects that all he needed to do was reach out. His hands always found something to grab. More insects fell to his reconstruction skill. He probably didn't need to use it, but it was helping with his imitations. The health he drained in making the imitations of Priscilla was recovering almost as quickly. It was an obvious combination of the two skills, but he hadn't had the opportunity to utilize it yet. This was probably the ideal situation for it. The first two imitations of Priscilla broke off from him. They had the simple command to just eat as many as they could. Magic might work, but this was simpler and more effective. Eating the insects would make him stronger, and it might do the same for them. He didn't just stop at two replicas either. Another pair started growing from his back. He couldn't see or hear, but he pushed forward. He raised his feet higher than usual and brought them down with more force too. The snow crunched, and each step left a tiny crater. More importantly, it would stop him from slipping again. He ignored the sound of other things breaking as he took another step. Luke P.O.V. Luke had been surprised by the number of insects that had climbed out of the hole. And he grew a little worried when he realized that the outpour of monsters hadn't slowed in the slightest. He thought of their group rather highly. They were strong for their level with classes that were made unique by their experiences. Not to mention the things that they had gained beyond their world. Despite all of that, he still wasn't sure how they would fare against an actual army. Even weak monsters posed a problem when they came in numbers. He remembered the first mission they had been on and the rats that had almost killed some of them. That had only been several hundred rats, but there were already more insects here. The flow hadn't even stuttered. He slammed a golden fist against one creature's head. It popped in gore, and it was disgusting. However, he had noticed that anything else wouldn't kill them. Plus, they seemed to resist a lot of magic. He had wondered if general magical resistance was a thing. The guild claimed that some monsters had it, but he had kind of assumed it would just mean resistance to the most common types. Apparently, it was an indiscriminate resistance to all things that used mana. However, it didn't do anything to stop his fists when he buffed them. Jill was similarly impaired. Unlike him though, she had to rely entirely on her weapon. It was strange, but her weapon's effect wasn't magical. He would ask her about it later. He just made sure to keep everyone in sight. As a team, they were basically invincible, or close enough to it. Jill's teleport and his remote healing were a good combo. All he needed to be keep an eye on everyone. Although the fight had shown him something else. As significant and powerful as his class might be, he was somewhat reliant on other people. The stronger his teammates were, the stronger he was. When he used his buffs on others, they improved him a little too. And he realized now what that fully meant for him. He hadn't used his buffs on Mash, and he was significantly weaker for it. It was dumb, but he had been worried for Jill after she had used so much mana to move the snow. He knew that she would teleport away from any danger. But that wasn't the point. He had honestly thought that they were best when fighting together. And there was some truth to that. Both he and Jill could support almost anyone. Although this fight had made something evident. Red and Mash didn't need their support. Luke and Jill didn't need it, but it wasn't the same thing. Red and Mash seemed to do nearly as well with or without help. He could see Red fighting in the distance. Red's entire body was blood, and the monster crashed into it constantly. That only left a trail of dead monsters, as her blood was literally diseased. It wasn't a poison, which meant it was much harder to resist. She would be especially effective against people. There were few healing skills for diseases, and they were usually pretty inefficient. His own healing abilities weren't great for it. These insects couldn't even do it, and she left a trail of dead in her area. Discolored bodies that he was sure would poison the lands. They would need to be burned, or maybe it would be better if some of Mash's creations ate them. She was killing them faster than anyone else. Not to mention that she hadn't even taken any damage. These monsters didn't seem to have anything other than physical attacks. So long as Red kept her body malleable, these monsters wouldn't be able to hurt her. Even seeing her decimate insect after insect wasn't the most impressive sight. He killed another 2 insects, before turning his gaze over to Mash. Well, where he was supposed to be. Luke couldn't actually tell with the mass of writhing insects surrounding him. For some reason, most of the insects were congregating around him. If they were fighting hundreds, there was at least 1,000 wriggling around Mash. If it was anyone else, he would assume that they were dead. Crushed by the weight if nothing else. But Priscilla had told him several times that Mash was fine. Chapter 287, Disturbed. Luke P.O.V. Luke vaguely could sense when his friends got hurt. He assumed it was a secondary effect of his war cleric's bond. Even without seeing them, he always had an idea of how they were doing so long as they were relatively close by. So, Priscilla's reassurance felt off. Mash had definitely been hurt, but Luke didn't really know how. He almost rushed over there but stopped when he heard a roar. Something monstrous, an impossible sound that echoed with the howl of a wolf. It carried despite the clacking of the insects. The entire mass of monsters seemed to pause. It rippled through their army. Many of the insects around him had turned their heads too. For an instant, everyone's attention drifted toward Mash. It was fear. A simple obvious reaction. One that spurred the remaining monsters into a furious charge. Luke was almost overwhelmed by the sudden burst of speed, but Jill teleported in front of him, and her javelin tore through the monsters. She wasn't injured, but her hands were stained by the monsters' foul-smelling blood. Even now the smell bothered him. All beastmen regardless of appearance had improved senses. All of them were a little better than the other people. Luke and Jill were slowly retreating, killing as many stragglers as they could. Red and Mash were trying to seal the hole. "You think he's all right?" He looked at Jill and spoke too softly. With the charging of the insects, he didn't think she would hear, but she replied simply. "That's what Priscilla said." Jill nodded before teleporting toward another group of the monsters. She was really good at catching the stragglers. Honestly, Luke felt kind of useless at the moment. His heals and buffs were on the people he could see, and there wasn't much he could. He had tried using soul magic, but killing the insects one at a time was only so useful. There was nothing he could do to an army like this. Jill too was only slightly more effective. Her explosion might work, but it could just lead to another exit for the insects to take. He punched through another monster. The fight edged on slowly. The horde of monsters that surrounded Mash morphed. They bulged in places. It centered on Mash, but it shifted. The insects around him spread out a little, and the mass grew misshaped. Several large areas started growing outwards, like some kind of strange pimple. Luke continued to peek at it as he fought with the other monsters. He wished he had a vision skill like Mash. The only thing he had were eyes, and he caught glimpses of the mass as it continued to warp. The next glance revealed several large wooden snakes. They had burst from the insects and were plucking and eating the insects like a bird. Their beaked mouths were exact replicas of Priscilla, and they had no trouble picking apart the insects. The monsters were relentless though and scratched at the wood as they trampled past them. Even with the wooden monstrosities, the insects just surged on. Luke bet that they were still chasing Mash. Luke's gaze drifted down the mass, and he caught a small glimpse of Mash. It caused him to pause. Or more like the sight froze him, and he recoiled in horror. Mash did not look normal. It wasn't just his transformation either. His head was odd. The places where his eyes, ears, and nose were supposed to be was gone. Replaced by scales that matched the rest of his face. The only thing he still had was his mouth, which he used to devour some insects. His appearance alone would be scary, but there was something else that caused Luke to stare. Mash wasn't fighting like normal. His hands moved quickly, but he didn't punch or claw. His clawed hands grabbed an insect, and Luke watched the monster break. Its whole body cracked and crumpled until its body was absorbed into his hands. Luke didn't want to look, but he was transfixed. He had to remind himself of what Mash was really like, despite what his eyes revealed to him. A few insects scratched at his flesh, but the wounds healed soon after they formed. He just kept staring at Mash. Luke's vision let him see what Mash was doing, and he didn't know what to do. The monsters that Mash was grabbing were breaking. Not just their bodies either. Everything, their souls included, was being broken down and absorbed by Mash. That wasn't something people were supposed to do. There were few taboo skills among beastmen, but that was definitely one. He stared at Mash, right up until more insects swarmed the location and hit him again. Luke knew Mash better than most. Mash caused trouble everywhere he went. But he was never to blame for it. No, if anything Mash would try and prevent it. He was the kind of person to offer his help even if it wasn't wanted. He was quick to action, which often led to more problems than they solved. Luke and almost everyone else found themselves joining Mash if only to keep up with him. There was something about him that made Luke want to keep up. Seeing someone try so hard to do the right thing was hard to ignore. And it was even harder to not try and do the same. Luke fought on, but his eyes kept drifting to where he thought Mash was. He had missed his opportunity to buff him again. Mash P.O.V. Mash was slowly making progress. There were a lot of bugs. Even if they couldn't really damage him, they slowed him just by existing. Even if he turned every monster he grabbed to dust, it meant little when another filled the space almost instantly. He was impressed by how tightly the monsters could squeeze together. The way the limbs surrounded one another made it feel like he was staring at a single mass. A puzzle, where all of the pieces were tightly bound. He had no idea how many insects there were, but he knew that he was making progress. The trail his large steps made was visible with his domain. He opened his mouth slowly, and let insects stuff their limbs into the only vulnerable place they could reach. He felt them try to scratch at his throat, and he slammed his mouth shut and swallowed. His skill probably stopped him from choking or even gagging when he stuffed the large parts down his throat. It wasn't smooth though. The skill didn't stop his mind from thinking that he should be choking. Some of the limbs scraped against his throat as he swallowed them, but they lost their cutting power. His skill somehow weakened the things he ate. They didn't dissolve exactly. It was more like they just broke until they managed to fit. He imagined his throat was just crushing them. Yeah, that was probably fine. His skill hadn't failed him yet. Plus, the stats he gained were adding up now. The insects probably could have overwhelmed most people at his level, but he was not something they could take. Especially now that he had sealed any weaknesses on his body. Scales had grown over any weaknesses. Mash didn't charge through the monsters. That was impossible, and his anger had waned. It had dripped from him with every step. Although it didn't change anything. Angry or not, he still needed to stop these things. There were a lot of bugs, and he was a little worried about them overwhelming the other things in the area. Honestly, he knew that even sealing the exit was only a temporary solution. Monsters like these were problematic. They would evolve and grow if nobody dealt with them. Just because they were weak now didn't mean much. Monsters were by their nature aggressive creatures. Few monsters kept to themselves. These insects would become a much bigger issue if they were left alone. The guild's record had mentioned them but had implied that they were new to the area. He wished he had known how old the information was, but he hadn't considered it important. Dumb decisions could define his life if he let them. He shook his head a little sadly, as another pair of insects fell to his touch. All he could do was grow. Avoid making the same mistakes, or, if he did, recognize them. Monsters died and he moved. Time slipped away, and he had no idea how many of the things had died. There was no trail of bodies for him to count. The only thing that he left behind were indentations in the snow. And most of those had been replaced by the footsteps of the monsters or the ever-falling snow. He was close to the hole now though. It had finally entered his senses. The insects had made it bigger, and he could see more insects still trying to escape. They climbed over one another. He had to seal them, and a simple piece of wood wouldn't do that. His hands touched the snow as he bent down. He held them there for a second, before letting wood grow out from them. It grew, pushing many of the monsters aside. They tried to stop it, but they couldn't do anything with just numbers. The wood grew out pushing them aside. It grew out covering the ground. He made it grow quickly, but insects still managed to squeeze around it. The monsters clawed at it, and he felt the vibrations run through the wood. It didn't break. He didn't really block the hole. Rather he filled it. His wood poured into the hole. Since he couldn't see, he had to rely on his sense of touch. The wood was an extension of his body, and he would be able to know when he reached the other side. He would know when he touched the bottom. It wasn't some grand plan, but it was simple. These things were bugs, and he was just going to squish them. The wood pushed down and across. It didn't flow like water but grew as a tree might. He felt it when the wood crushed the first insect. He had almost forgotten they had blood. It was obvious, but he had killed so many without even seeing a drop of it. Now, he felt the liquid through the wood. The insects got pressed into the walls and ground, but he didn't stop. It kept growing down, unending as his energy had long since gone beyond its limits. Ironically, these monsters around him would give him the energy to fill more than just the hole. Wood grew from more than just his hands. It sprouted from his back as sharp spears of wood. They didn't kill the insects, but they could pierce them and stop them from running. He just aimed at everything in his domain. Quickly his domain was filled with insects that were trapped with him. Trapped to him. Stuck by wood that grew through their bodies. His control wasn't perfect, but Priscilla could help him. His wood grew through each creature it pierced. Magical resistance was useful against a lot, but ironically magic that made real things could get around it. His wood worked well enough. The wood was a part of him though. Chapter 288, Senses. He felt each branch like it was his own fingers. The sensation of it squirming through the monsters was far worse than he could have imagined. It wasn't something he wanted to think about, but the wet feeling of blood was quickly covering everything. Those that were being crushed, and those that were stabbed, spilled blood. Thankfully his nose was sealed. He remembered how bad the blood had smelled and was glad to not be accosted by it. Touch was the only sense he had left, and he felt his way through the army of insects. Each branch was a part of him, and he could grow it beyond his domain, even if he couldn't see past it. He just had to feel his way forward. The ends of the wood would flail a little and only pause when they met contact with another monster. Honestly, he had never considered fighting while sealing all of his normal senses. His domain let him function just as well, and it took away a lot of his weaknesses. It also let him focus on what he had left. When the ends of his branches met with another insect, he made sure to trap or kill any insect that he could. The monsters didn't die from what was essentially a stake through the chest. Although some died, when he started making more branches sprout within the monsters' bodies. They crawled through the insects' bodies. They were much more vulnerable underneath their carapace, not that it mattered with his stats. Some of the thinner strands of wood pushed through the insects and punched out from various places along their bodies. Beneath him, his wood expanded out into a tunnel. More of the monsters had been rushing for the exit, but they were now stopped by a wooden pike that filled the tunnels and grew into their homes. Mash couldn't see what was happening, but he knew that things were dying. He leveled and knew. Plus, he could feel it when the wood crushed an insect. The wood was an extension of himself, and it was like he was pushing the bugs or stomping them against the walls and floors. The monsters didn't stop though. They swarmed toward what must have been the only escape. It wasn't one anymore, and the monsters died as they squished themselves against the wedge he had made. He had shaped it like a nail and drove it through the ground. Split whenever he felt another tunnel and dug into that as well. That would make it even harder to move. He didn't want to take any chances though, and made sure to dig into the ground itself in some locations. He imagined a tree in its entirety. What he was making now were the roots, and he made sure to spread them through the dirt. Mash filled the tunnel for a while, only stopping once he felt like the monsters had given up. They must have realized that there was no longer an exit in this tunnel. At the very least, they stopped charging toward their deaths. He stopped feeling anything from the end of the wood. Well, he still felt the wall of corpses that had piled up in the tunnel, but he didn't feel anything trying to push at it anymore. Even these things had figured out that they weren't making any progress. Or maybe, there were just too many corpses for them to do anything. The tunnels had gone still, but the fight wasn't done yet. Mash didn't rise or go to his friends. He remained hunched, his hands pressed against the ground. Not the dirt, but a small barrier of wood that separated his hands from the snow. No new snow could make it to him either. Above him, the insects formed an umbrella of corpses. And beyond that, there were even more monsters that were simply impaled by wooden branches. He didn't move. Rather, he couldn't move. The insects, even dead, were trapped in place by his wood. Like a bush, all the branches had grown from him, and he was stuck in place by the weight of it all. The wood was heavy, but it was the thousands of corpses that really dragged him down. His strength had its limits, and this was too much weight even for his dragon form. So, he was hunched over on the ground. His knees shook as he tried to push himself up. The dirt beneath them shifted as he tried to move. It wasn't snow, which felt at odds with what he had seen before. He slowly opened his eyes. He was expecting the light to sting, but he felt none of it. The light could only barely get past the mass of monster bodies, so he had no trouble adjusting to it even though his eye had been shut tightly for a while. He kept his nose and ears covered. Not in the mood to smell or hear what he could now see. That was only a small part of what was truly around him. His domain far exceeded what he could see with his eyes, but there was something different about seeing something with all of its colors and details. His domain had shown him the shapes of things, but his eyes let him see more. Even in darkness, he realized the real reason that he couldn't feel any snow around him. The blood of the monsters was vaguely warm, and it covered every inch of what he could see. He should have realized that it was blood on his body, but without his sense of smell, he had just assumed it was water from melted snow. And he didn't want to smell it either. He remembered how much the blood stank and wanted to take a bath before removing the scales which had grown over his nose. Then he thought of Red and realized that she could remove the blood easily. All he had to was get out of his own creation. The monster bodies were not making it easy. Some monsters were still alive too. He could feel them. A few were even in his direct vision. Although one of them was little more than a snapping head. These monsters were certainly stubborn if nothing else. He thought about how to deal with all of the bodies around him. He could grow more wood and try and move them, but that would take a while. Just use the same skill you used before. Priscilla's message was not exactly aggressive, but she was annoyed. He knew why too. The fight had drawn his attention, and he snapped when they had actually managed to hurt him. He completely ignored Priscilla for most of the fight, and she obviously didn't like that. Which was something he could understand, but not something he was prepared to deal with now. Instead, he pushed the conversation back and tried what she had suggested. The branches, that were still connected to his back, should function as if they were another part of his body. Just as good as his arms in theory. His chimeric restoration should work. Plus, most of these were injured or dead, so it would probably be even easier. He focused on the insects. The monsters that had been skewered by the wood. No, not wood, but his fingers. His arms and hands. That is what they were, and he held the image in his head as the skill started. The monsters crumpled. All of them almost simultaneously broke as the skill activated. He couldn't hear it, but he felt it. And he saw some of it but had to shut his eyes as small bits of shell fell. They were small, closer to dust than pieces of its shell, but he kept his eyes closed anyways. He watched with his domain. The process was fascinating, regardless of how many times he had seen it now. There was no perfect way to describe what happened to the monsters. They broke down, crumbling in on themselves. Some pieces flaked away like dust, but most of the monster broke into the wooden limb. It fell into the wood as it wasn't there. But when it melted with the wood it seeped into it like water might. The strange sight left him stunned for a moment. His eyes were still closed but he knew that there were no monsters left. The fight was over, but strangely he wasn't out of energy. He pushed himself up. The branches around him broke off as he separated himself from them. They broke into pieces. They weren't exactly stable. He had been holding the structure up, but now he let it collapses. It broke in different places. Thin sections of wood broke, and heavy sections fell to the ground. The thinnest pieces broke as well and many of them broke like splinters. They floated a little in the wind as the larger pieces fell through them. He stretched his back out. It felt like it cracked, and he let out a long sigh. He stretched his arms out and moved them from side to side. As he moved, he felt it when his hunt skill stopped boosting his stats. He waited for the feeling of exhaustion to paralyze him, but it never came. He was stunned for a moment but then realized what must have happened. It seemed like he had recovered enough energy to compensate for the feedback. Chimeric restoration and hunt interacted strangely. It was a good thing as it seemed like he could avoid the paralysis effect of hunt so long as he had some energy at the end of it. And he got to keep the boost too. He thought about the skill and didn't think that was how it was supposed to work, and focused inward to check. Name, Mash Stel Lumber Class, Chimeric Vagabond. Level, 112-121. Health, 3330/3330. Energy, 481/4590. Fortitude, 333. Endurance, 210-229. Strength, 275-278. Agility, 275-279. Intelligence, 230. Wisdom, 130. Charisma, 110. Free stats, 4130. Skills, Hunt, Thunderwood Creation, Inhuman Hibernation, Chimeric Transformation, Thunderwood Imitation, Chimeric Reconstruction, Vagabond's Path, Chimeric Domain, Adaptable Monster Core, Chimera's Constitution, Wooden Body, Mimics Avarice, A Touch of Nothingness, Golden Body. Hunt, you have gone beyond your limits when fighting enemies and devouring their power. Go beyond your limits. Continue the current fight even after depleting energy. Stats improve while at when stamina drops below 0. Continues until either you or your enemies are dead. Current bonus, plus 100% stats. Mash didn't know exactly what to expect, but 9 levels were a lot more than he expected. Even if thousands of the monsters had died, it felt like a lot. And he didn't even consider the stats. It was mostly endurance, which kind of meant sense considering what the insects were like, but it was a lot plus, he also had a lot of free stats to work with. He forgot that his class had been giving him more after the last advancement. All of that didn't even include the fact that he had upgraded another skill. Those weren't small improvements, and he started to chuckle. The fight was over now, and the tension that had been there broke with it. With improvements like that, he couldn't help but feel a little giddy. His chuckle became a full laugh. There was no sound to it. Well, he couldn't hear it with his ears sealed by scales. He felt the vibrations through his body, but it was strange to not be able to hear them. His mind tried to fill in the missing sound. There was something distinctly wrong about it not coming from his ears though. He freed his ears and ended the transformation altogether. He could deal with the smell of the blood for a little bit. Plus, he could vaguely see what he looked like with his domain, and it wasn't exactly human. Chapter 289, Skilled Intentions. Red P.O.V. The fight was over. Red wasn't sure even when the flood of insects had ceased. Now she was certain. The insects that surrounded Mash turned to dust. She wasn't sure what he was doing to do that, but not one insect remained on what she had been referring to as a shrub. Jill had been the first to call it that, but the name had stuck. The thousands of insects stuck to the branches kind of looked like leaves. Their carapace was vaguely green too, and they were packed densely around Mash. The branches only added to the look. Seeing him appear, hearing the bone-chilling laugh made her wish that the shrub still had its leaves. Mash looked disturbing. His head wasn't shaped right. He didn't have eyes, ears, or even a nose. All she could see was a seamless mass of scales. Even his hair was gone. Now that she was thinking of it, his usual appearance was strange too. His face looked mostly human, but it just had scales instead of skin. And his teeth morphed into something that would better fit a shark. That still wasn't the same as this. That was disturbing, this was just wrong. All she could see was a mouth. One that felt larger than feasible. It was probably the same size as normal, but it felt bigger when there was nothing else there. His laugh didn't help. She shivered as the sound echoed as if two different creatures were making it. She almost felt like it was coming from multiple places, but nothing else could sound like that. The unhindered laughter carried through the air. The raw joy of it didn't match at all with the emotion she felt hearing it. The moment was as inspiring as it was terrifying. There had been thousands of monsters. She couldn't even estimate how many had been stuck on his creation, but they were all gone now. The swarm that had clumped around Mash was an army. A mountain of the insects that eclipsed what she had fought. It wasn't really a fair comparison. Mash's skills made him perfect for fighting monsters like that. Plus, she couldn't fight continuously like him. The battle had been rather long, in that it had lasted several hours. She didn't know exactly how long, but she had needed to set up a rotation with Luke and Jill. It would have been impossible for anyone without unlimited stamina. She was the most effective of the three and spent most of the time fighting, but her mana had its limits, and she couldn't exceed that limit like Mash. So, she rotated with Jill and Luke. Even with the rotation, she had leveled a lot. She had gained 7 levels from the fight. Which was impossible. All of what her family had taught her went against the idea. Someone over level 100 didn't just gain 7 levels in a few hours. It didn't happen. The number of monsters they killed shouldn't matter. Even after checking multiple times, the very notion was unthinkable. She couldn't help but wonder if everyone was leveling this fast. Her parents certainly hadn't. Her father had spent decades going from 100 to 150. Although he didn't really look his age. It was a byproduct of how levels extended someone's life. Most strong people looked young. With all that hanging in the back of her head, she still knew that she would be even younger than expected. Her father was considered exceptional for his time, yet it had taken him nearly half a century to reach that level. All of that made her worried. Why were they leveling so fast? If Mash had been right, what was the world owner preparing them for? Who was going to invade? Her questions cut off as Luke broke out of the moment, his shout shattering him from her thoughts. What happened? What did you do? Mash p.o.v. Mash laughed and laughed. He could feel his lungs straining with the effort and had to bite his tongue to stop. Luke had stepped into his domain and was running toward him. Mash turned slowly, opening his eyes. The light bothered him a little bit. A small sting made him want to rub his eyes, but he noticed Luke was shouting something. Then realized he couldn't hear a single word and remembered that he had scales over his ears. Mash let the transformation break, and the scales slowly vanished. They receded slowly, melting into his skin as the insects had. Mash stopped laughing, but he smiled as Luke walked up. The smile didn't drop until he actually heard what Luke was saying. You ate them. I mean, you ate their souls. Absorbed them like a necromancer. His voice went from a shout to a whisper within a few steps. He realized what he was saying and was obviously trying to hide. Sweat left a bright sheen on Luke's forehead, which was impressive considering the clod. Then Mash recognized that look. The slight vibration in his hands. Luke was afraid. He was terrified, and Mash's first instinct was to feel bad. He didn't really know what he had done, but Luke's fear bothered him. Mash hesitated and almost stepped away when Priscilla stopped him. It's not at you. The simple message got him to freeze, and he realized what she made. His domain let him know. Let him understand a little about the people inside of it. And he realized that Luke wasn't afraid of him, but for him. Well, that was different, and he was left uncertain. Wait, what? And what are you afraid of? Luke got close. He almost stepped on Mash's own feet. Luke's hands shot out, grabbing hold of Mash's shoulders in a quick motion. Mash didn't move, didn't even flinch. But he did realize something. Luke was big. They both had muscle, but Mash's didn't really stand out. Luke's muscles bulged, though Mash hadn't really noticed before. Now that Luke was standing right in front of him, Mash came to the realization that Luke needed better choices in clothing. It wasn't that he wore a robe, but his clothes were loose. Which had made sense back when Luke's body had physically changed with his skills. Now Luke was essentially aura-based. He could do with some better-fitting clothes. Those thoughts passed through his head in an instant. Luke's whispered response drew his attention. Do you feel any different? Luke shook him a little as he yelled at him. Mash's response vibrated with the shaking, not that it mattered. It had only been a single word after all. What? That was clearly not the answer he was suspecting. Mash stepped away from Luke, pushing his hands away. He didn't really like the shaking. Luke had also leaned in as he spoke. Mash decided he didn't really like feeling another person's breath. It was noticeable too as Luke's breath was visible in the cold air. Mash leaned away from it, and Luke mirrored him. He had probably gotten closer than he realized. Looking a little shamefaced, Luke backed up a bit before explaining. He visibly gathered himself as Red and Jill approached. You can't use soul skills like that. It will warp your mind. Luke said it like it was obvious. He was met with blank stares and empty faces. His gaze spun around but there was nothing. Not even Red seemed to know what he was talking about. She noticed his gaze and replied simply. Sorry, but the only person to really talk about soul skills was you. Luke's eyebrows rose a little. That doesn't make sense. It's pretty common, among beastmen. His voice broke a bit as he realized what the problem was. Mash understood what he meant then. Soul skills weren't something humans could get naturally. He kind of had one now, but he wasn't really human anymore either. He wasn't sure about the other races, but beastmen were the only ones who could get those skills from the beginning. All the most famous necromancers in history were beastmen. The living ones were also beastmen. I'm not going to become a necromancer. Despite what Luke was saying, Mash didn't really feel like it applied to him. He said as much and said it with confidence. His skill might affect the souls of the monsters he used it on, but he didn't notice any differences in his thoughts. And he felt like somewhat of an expert when it came to being influenced by skills or classes. Luke shook his head slightly. Necromancers aren't just classes to raise the dead. Most of them have the skills to devour people's souls. Your skill did the same thing. Yeah, but it didn't do anything to my mind. Priscilla would notice even if I didn't. Mash tried to explain that nothing happened. His skill wasn't what he thought it was, but Luke was insistent. But you plan on using it again? Mash nodded his head with little hesitation. He didn't see the problem. They were just monsters, and it makes it so that I don't need to feel the consequences of hunt. It's too useful. Luke searched Mash's face, trying to find something that wasn't there. Mash just stared back, unsure of what Luke wanted from him. He had an idea though. I won't use it on people. Mash meant every word. He imagined using the skill on someone alive and watching as their body broke down. A shiver ran down his spine, utterly independent of the cold temperature. He could almost imagine the kind of pain and horror he would be inflicting on someone and knew that it would be a bad idea. He had done enough horrible things to people. Luke seemed to relax a little at that. I know you won't. And I trust you that you would know if it was changing you, but just be careful. Those skills are dangerous. I can't be certain your skill is the exact same though. You might be completely fine, but... He cut off what he was saying and looked at him for a second. Just looked at Mash. Even if he didn't say it explicitly, it was clear that Luke believed that Mash wouldn't be careful. It was a shared opinion as Red and Jill both nodded their heads. He could even feel Priscilla agreeing, and she even sent a message to reaffirm it. I will notice any changes to his mind. It was Priscilla's message that seemed to reassure Luke the most. Mash wondered what that said about their group, that Priscilla was the most restrained among them. Not that Mash disagreed, but it was still weird to consider. They weren't really careful, especially when it came to fighting and leveling. And everything else too. Mash didn't disagree, but he didn't need to hear it either. Thankfully, it didn't seem like that message was sent to everyone. Well, he made his promise, and he would keep it. Luke himself said he might be wrong, but he wasn't going to take the risk. Arguing about it was different from actually doing something so dangerous. Although, he knew that there would eventually come a time when he would need to use it again. Hopefully, it would just be for monsters, but he didn't think that he would be that lucky. Whatever fate he had, it wasn't a kind one. There was no doubt in his mind about that. Chapter 290, The Risk of Connections. Mash's soul magic discussion ended up dragging into the cleanup, which had mostly fallen upon Mash and Red. Mash dealt with the bodies, using a few wooden creations to devour them. He could have used reconstruction, but after a long discussion, he decided against it. There was no problem with using the skill on dead monsters, even Luke couldn't object to it. However, Luke was obviously shaken by the skill, so Mash decided against using it at the moment. Red had a different kind of clean-up task. She pulled out an oddly metallic book. Well, the covers were made of metal, but the inside seemed like some normal paper. Metal rings joined the two covers. They were designed in such a way that someone could pull them apart to replace the pages inside. The rings just bound everything together. Red had explained that the general had given it to her. As it turned out, the general wanted to keep abreast of their actions. Especially, when it came to finding or discovering something that could prove problematic to the kingdom. Red's specific instructions were to update the general whenever they fought something. So, Red had taken the job of letting the kingdom know about the changes to the monsters in the area. It was an important job. Monsters like those insects could jeopardize a city. Their sheer numbers could overwhelm a smaller city. However, it was the villages that would be in the most danger. Red had told everyone what she planned on reporting, and Mash listened while he cleaned the grounds. She had dictated the words to Luke while writing them in the book. The book would apparently copy its text into a replica that the general had. It seemed kind of cheap. They could have just contacted his brother with Priscilla, but Red told him not to. The general had asked Red to do this because Arthur was already working too hard. Mash could picture that too. His brother was the type to do everything excellently, and he would put in the time and effort to show it too. Red was left to write what she wanted, and she exaggerated the story greatly. The way she spoke made the wolves seem several times stronger than they were, but it was her report on the insects that really felt wrong. She wrote that even the smallest of the bugs could threaten an adventurer, but he didn't think that. Even without his skills, he could have dealt with any insect individually. Luke thought the same and asked her about it. She said it would provoke a response from the larger cities. Meaning that the nearby settlements would get protection sooner, and the insect's hive would only be explored by exceptionally high-leveled individuals. She was lying to the general and their home, but none of them protested it. A lie to help people, was one they could all live with. The cleanup went smoothly. Mash didn't look too hard, but he couldn't see any more insect corpses. Even if there were a few bodies left, they were buried by the snow. It was good enough. Red was done with her report as well. After she finished, they left. They could have stayed and continued to fight the monsters. They probably could have even joined the general in whatever she had planned. He imagined she would come and exterminate as many insects as she could. Monster hives like these could easily overflow and probably would have soon. His fate finally seemed to do something good. Even if it was due to someone else's preparations. It took a lot of responsibility off his own shoulders. He might be selfish, but he was fine with that. The general could do a better job than him anyways. Not to mention, his tendency to make things worse. Especially when he lingered somewhere. Also, he had made a promise to Timur and would keep it. The whole group was interested in visiting another continent. Another kingdom that was truly unique. The air was cold in his face, and it would only get colder the further north they went. They flew through the sky, but not over the mountains. Mash stared up into the clouds and felt uneasy about it. The fact that they were so high up didn't help with the freezing air, although it did make it easier to avoid the mountains. Plus, it meant they had to take fewer detours, though they still needed to take some. Some mountains they passed were so large that it was easier to fly around them than above them. Mash remembered the first time he flew upward. When he had pierced the veil that hid those grand monsters of the skies. He didn't think he was ready for that. They flew lower to the ground, but still near the top of most of the mountains. Only a few of the mountains managed to pierce the clouds, and they could avoid those easily enough. Although it was hard to see. They didn't go above the clouds, and there had been a constant stream of snowfall. It wasn't falling quickly, but he flew fast enough to make the snow explode when it struck his skin. Some of it turned to water, and he could feel his hair slowly becoming wet. It was cold, but he could easily control his body temperature. Although that didn't stop the water from clinging to his clothes. The others couldn't do the same, but they had bought items to deal with it. They all had coats with a minor warmth enchantment on them. They could have just let Mash go on his own, and then Jill could teleport to him. He was the one who knew where to go. His connection to the imitation of Priscilla was still there, and he could follow it easily. The fact that the link was there meant that Timur was alive, and he had kept the imitation out of any storage item. Mash wasn't sure if Timur would trust him, but he was glad to see it. Honestly, he wasn't sure if Timur should. Mash tended to bring things with him. He wasn't so despondent as to blame himself anymore, but events chased him. A few had been good, but most were just chaotic. Timur didn't know what Mash was. The things that Mash might bring to his home. Mash was tempted to send Timur a message, but it probably wasn't the time for it. They were still a good bit away. Even if they flew as fast as possible, it would still take them a week at the very least. He would let Timur know, but only after they got closer. He knew he should let Timur know, but he hesitated. It was a discussion he didn't want to have. Mash didn't want to preface every relationship he made with a discussion of the risks of knowing him. That just sounded miserable. Either way, the group wanted to stop if they saw a city or something. So, he wasn't sure exactly how long it would take to even get to Timur's home. The others wanted to fly together. They were curious about the north and wanted to see the lands. Mash couldn't disagree. Unlike his home, the land here wasn't blemished by towns or cities. The wind kicked up snow in between mountains. It filled the valleys in what looked like a flowing river of white water. Where the wind slowed, the mountains were covered in a pristine carpet of snow. The tallest mountains' snowy tops blended in with the clouds they punched into. Mash wanted to fly into them, to soar past into that place far above them. To tread among dragons and other beings that claimed that place. He didn't do it and flew on through the snowfall that threatened to blind them. If not for his connection, he was sure they would have gotten lost a few times. The snow would have made it near impossible to know where to go. He wondered how the people got around. Maybe they didn't? He hadn't seen anything like roads or cities of any kind just yet and imagined they might live outside the main mountain range. The edges might have more open areas for roads and towns. Although that didn't really align with what he had learned about the area. The north was known for its mountain kingdoms. Day changed to night, and it grew dark quickly. The sun was already mostly blocked by the clouds and snow, but the night was something else altogether. It wasn't pitch black, but the darkness was deep. Little light touched the night, but where it did it made the snow glow. The snow seemed to capture the moonlight. Each piece seemed to glow faintly. They were moving quickly, and the snow rushed past his vision. During the day, the snow had been familiar. Now it was like a stream of lights. With how fast they were moving, it seemed more like the stars themselves were falling. An endless shower of tiny comets swarmed across his vision. The mountains would have been hidden by the night, but patches of snow was illuminated by some rays of moonlight that managed to sneak by the clouds. The mountains were given a faint outline as the snow reflected the light. Mash took in the sight. It was something he had never seen before. He was so entranced by the image, that he barely noticed when Jill stopped. They had been flying together, but they had all been taking in the sights. He only really noticed when she left his domain, and he paused mid-flight. He was the last to notice, and he flew back to see what happened. He guessed she was running low on mana and would need to rest. Honestly, he expected to take more breaks, but their flight skills were fairly efficient. Mash just had enough energy to exceed them. There's something over there. They communicated through messages rather than words. It was hard to hear one another with the wind and snow. Jill floated in place and stretched one shaking hand toward a mountain as Priscilla sent her message around. She was least able to deal with the cold but insisted on handling it herself. It was obviously too cold though, and Mash raised the temperature around him. She glanced at him but didn't protest this time. His gaze turned to follow her finger. At first, Mash didn't see anything special. It just looked like a normal mountain. It was the tallest mountain in the area, but it wasn't the tallest he had seen. Its peak didn't actually reach the clouds. He could see the peak clearly as it was outlined by a strange orange hue. He didn't think anything of it, but then realized why it was important. And he stated the obvious. It's a volcano. It's a warm place to take a rest for the night. Jill's message explained what he had already understood. He just hadn't said it. I believe we could all use a break. And we aren't likely to find many warm places this far north. Red sent a message and started drifting toward the volcano. Mash followed simply. The volcano was still a good distance away, so Mash planned on staying near Jill to help her stay warm. He didn't think she would object anymore, and he felt bad for not doing it earlier. She had wanted to deal with it herself, but he should have helped anyways. Although, there wasn't a huge risk. Luke could heal sickness just as well as frostbite, so Jill wasn't in any real danger. There just wasn't any real reason for her to suffer for no reason. He planned on telling her as much once they set up camp. Jill grabbed everyone. stretching one arm to pull Red and Luke together. Her other hand grabbed his shoulder.